Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for tuning in for the project Understanding Bilingual Children's Voices Using Adult Models. My name is Wright, Karem, and I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Cincinnati. This work that I'll be presenting to you today is one article of my integrated article dissertation. So I'd like to first and foremost thank my dissertation advisor, mentor, and colleague, Dr. Karla Washington. I'd also like to thank my dissertation committee and the parents, adults, children, and educators who supported this study. A few disclosure statements for us today. Dr. Karla Washington is a principal investigator on a National Institute of Health NIH research grant. And she is also a co-investigator for the United States Department of Education Preparation of Special Education, Early Intervention, and Related Services Leadership Personnel Grant. I am fortunate to be a scholar, a part of that grant. And the work that we'll talk about today, funding was provided by an endowment, the Jamaican Creole Language Project, and a University of Cincinnati Vice President for Research Funds to Karla Washington. So setting the stage for this work, we know that across the world, the number of students who speak a language other than the language that is in the classroom environment on a daily basis is steadily growing. And we know that the proportion of bilingual children, children who speak multiple languages, is growing in educational settings. With this growing proportion of bilingual children in educational settings, we also see that bilingual children are at risk for misdiagnosis, and there can be a variety of reasons why this occurs. One primary reason is that there is substantial overlap between patterns that are indicators for language disorder and patterns that are very typical and appropriate in dual language development. We know as children are acquiring multiple languages, there are developmental patterns that they exhibit. And again, many of these patterns overlap with indicators for language disorder. One example that we see, say, is the omission or zero marking of bound morphemes, of small units of meaning. So even with the example of plural S, it's very commonplace for typically developing bilingual children to omit this bound morpheme. But we also know this is seen in children with language disorders. So this is one source of misdiagnosis. We also know that the typological properties of children's languages can impact their production in, say, an English-speaking context. So for the children that we'll be discussing today, thinking of Jamaican Creole, we know that Jamaican Creole does not have bound morphemes. So children may not produce said bound morpheme in the English context. And again, though a completely appropriate and typical production could be misinterpreted as an indicator for language disorder. We also know that most standardized assessments are standardized for monolingual speaking children. We know that these standardized assessments can have inherent cultural and linguistic bias, meaning that they were designed thinking that all children could have the similar experiences to produce a particular response towards an assessment item. But we also know that many children may have many different experiences, and specifically for bilingual children, children's languages may interact in different ways, and these interactions may not be realized within the context of a standardized assessment designed for monolingual children. It's been highly recommended in the literature and by the International Expert Panel of Multilingual Children's Speech that adaptations to standardized assessments can be used to improve the utility of them for understudied context or for bilingual children. And parent and adult models have been recommended as an approach to support interpreting children's performance. And yet we see in the literature that this is really an area that continues to be understudied. Now, the primary constructs here that we want to distinguish between for bilingual children is if a bilingual child has a language difference or a language disorder. Now, a language difference is what I've been describing for typical patterns in dual language development. It's going to be different than monolingual speakers, but it's still going to be rule-governed language use that deviates from the standard use of a mainstream culture, but again, is typical. On the other hand, a language disorder we can define as a significant discrepancy in language skills relative to what would be expected for a client when compared to others' age, gender, and developmental levels. So moving towards the Jamaican context and the context of this particular study, we know that Jamaicans are a growing population across the globe and represent 20% of Caribbean-born immigrants in the United States alone. So what this means is that there's a high likelihood that SLPs, practitioners, educators may come into contact with Jamaican Creole-speaking children. However, there's a mismatch in what we know and what we understand about Jamaican Creole and English language use and the tools that we have to appropriately serve this population of students. We also know that Jamaican Creole children are particularly at risk for misdiagnosis in English-dominant communities due to the close historical ties between Jamaican Creole and English. So this population was the particular focus of this study. We wanted to focus on Jamaican Creole and English speakers as, again, we know that this population is growing and that there is a likelihood that individuals, practitioners, speech-language pathologists will come into contact with JC English speakers. But we know that there's a mismatch in what information we know about their language performance and their risk for being misdiagnosed. So here our aims were to characterize the word structure and expressive vocabulary of JC English-speaking preschoolers compared to JC English-speaking adults. First, we needed to analyze what were the patterns of responses in JC English-speaking adults for morphosyntax as measured by a word structure subtest and lexical items as measured by an expressive vocabulary subtest on a commonly used standardized measure. And how do patterns of responses for JC English preschoolers compare with these adult responses on these subtests? For our participants, we had 33 24 to 51-year-old adult JC English speakers, and these speakers came from a variety of socioeconomic status, though the majority were employed at the time of the study. For children, we had 176 4 to 5-year-old JC English-speaking preschoolers who, again, came also from various socioeconomic status backgrounds. Some were from dual income homes, single income homes, and some families were unemployed. For our inclusion criteria, we used really a standard approach applied to the original data set from the Jamaican Creole Language Project. So in this standard approach, we modeled other standardized assessment inclusion criteria. And in this way, we wanted to ensure that we included children with an array of language capabilities. Now, we were very strategic about our inclusion criteria for the 4-year-old up through 5-11-month range, and this was based on literature that tells us that this particular age range is highly sensitive for documenting the developmental status of children's language use. And we also know that this age can be often the first time a child is diagnosed with a language disorder, where children may be particularly at risk for misdiagnosis. All children in this study were dual language learning, they passed a binaural hearing screening, and they were able to use spoken language in JC and English. Now, all children and adults completed the Clinical Evaluation of Language Fundamentals Preschool Second Edition in English. This is a very highly common standardized assessment measure that is often used and has been used for the past 30 years. Now, we strategically selected the word structure subtest and the expressive vocabulary subtest, as we also know these language domains are highly informative for distinguishing between language difference and language disorder in bilingual populations. And all children also completed a play-based language sample. Now, we analyzed 20% of these language samples to provide confirmatory evidence of the linguistic themes that we identified in the standardized assessment context. Now I'll unpack that a little bit more detail, but the purpose here was that we wanted to ensure that the themes that we identified in a standardized context were also present in a more spontaneous language context. So our data analysis, all adult and child responses to the SELF-P2 word structure and expressive vocabulary subtests were qualitatively analyzed using content analysis. Now, content analysis is highly beneficial for written text, as we had in this form, the children's responses and adults' responses, so that we could identify what were the linguistic themes in their responses and what were linguistic features that were commonplace in this particular assessment context. Now, we specifically looked at the English assessment context, as this is where misdiagnosis would be very highly likely to occur. And as I mentioned, we analyzed the language samples in the same fashion using content analysis for confirmatory evidence. So what did we find after completing our content analysis of adult and child responses in the standardized assessment context? Overall, we did identify three primary themes that were realized within adult and children's responses, and we saw substantial overlap between the responses that were coded for both adults and children. Now, importantly, we did also see these themes realized in the spontaneous language sample context for children as well. Now, I'll unpack each of these themes in more detail for each of the subtests that we see here. So first and foremost, for word structure, one primary theme that was identified was JC-influenced morphological structure. Now here you can see that adults and children had very similar proportions of their responses that were coded for this particular theme. So the N here is the total number of responses that were coded as containing this particular linguistic theme. Now, of course, we had more children than adults, so that is why you may see the children's total number of responses being higher than adults. But if we look at the proportion based on the total number of responses to this subtest and the total number that were coded according to this linguistic theme. Now, to unpack this a little bit more, we can see here through our examples, we saw, say, for the subtest item, the target item, say in this first example, would be climbed. Now here we saw that adults and children produced climb and used to climb. Now, if this were looked at through a monolingual lens alone, this response could be misinterpreted as an errored production or an indicator consistent with language disorder, when in fact we know that this would be highly appropriate looking at the adult models. Another common one that brings up the idea of bound morphemes, as I discussed earlier, is kings. We see here the bound morpheme would be this possessive S, but we saw both adults and children produced king and king crown. And this would be highly appropriate in the Jamaican context, and we see that the properties of Jamaican Creole are highly influencing English productions, and again, could be misdiagnosed. Now, our second theme was JC-influenced lexical variations. So here we see one example that highly occurred was for the target item of fell. We saw both adults and children use dropped. And again, we have very similar proportions of responses across adults and children. Now, use of functional description was not coded for this particular subtest, but I'll expand upon its use in the expressive vocabulary subtest. Now here we see for the expressive vocabulary subtest, we see our primary themes that were realized, but we see that morphological structure was not coded in this particular subtest. But if we look at JC-influenced lexical variations, we can see, again, very similar proportions of responses that were coded across adults and children. A couple of examples here that we found for the target item of newspaper, a very highly commonly used production, gleaner, that would not be realized in an English context alone, but when we have the adult model as the anchor, we can determine that this would be a very appropriate production for this population of speakers. Another very highly commonly used construct specifically for expressive vocabulary, commonly used theme, would be the use of functional description. And again, we know that this is a practice that is very commonly done in Jamaican culture, and we see that adults and children did have a similar proportion of responses that were coded according to this theme. One of my favorites that was used was for the item of scale. We saw adults and children use the response, test your weight. Now, I did have one child that said, oh, my mommy tests her weight and she looks down and she says, oh no. I said, I understand. But overall, we see that we did see consistent responses across adults and children. So what are our clinical implications here? First and foremost, we can see that using adult models in the English assessment context can provide a feasible and ecologically valid approach to understand the expressive language of an understudied population at risk for misdiagnosis in English dominant communities. We see that provided with additional information from adult models, we have a better anchor to compare children's performance and to interpret children's performance to help us distinguish between language difference and language disorder. We see that through this approach, through this feasible approach that we could use, we can address a critical gap in assessment and to cultivate more culturally responsive assessment practices and reduce misdiagnosis. The key here is that by using adult models, we provide the appropriate context so that children's voices are not only heard, but are better understood. We have references here for you, and I know this was a very quick snapshot of this study today, so please, we welcome you to please email us any further questions that you have about this work. Again, I'll move through the references a little bit here so you can also see some additional reading that supports this work. And we want to thank you for your time today and for your very kind attention.